All right, so we'll start here at the beginning. This is our third town hall. We're trying a different tool. We've done YouTube Live. We've done what was the other one we did there?
Facebook Live.
Facebook Live, and now we're trying WebEx. And so we'll see how that goes. So as we're doing this, I'd ask everybody both to make sure that you're muted and also that your video's off to ensure that we have maximum bandwidth available for this as it's being broadcast. Okay, so everybody should have received last night an email from me with the plan on how we're going to reintegrate as a district, as we're going to start through 5 phases. So phase 0 we're in now, plus 4 additional phases back to our pre-COVID work environment. And now this is the time period it'll take to go through these phases is going to be driven by the events and the conditions on the ground at the local community level. So how we progress through the phases here in Omaha is going to be different than how the area offices out in Colorado or the hydropower plants and the regulatory offices up in the upper basin progress through these phases. But the phases provide a structure for us to deliberately bring folks back to an office environment and reestablish operations as they were pre-COVID. So I want to give you a little context, though, before we dig into the plan and tell you the current situation as I'm tracking. In general, out in Colorado, we're starting to see an improved environment with a number of cases of COVID in a general decline. We're seeing significant improvement in the upper basin, Montana and Dakotas, with a number of cases dropping significantly as well. Unfortunately, we're not seeing the same level of improvement here in Douglas County, in the metro Omaha area, even though the state of Nebraska overall is seeing improvement. Currently in Douglas County, as of when I checked their dashboard about 30 minutes ago, there's 4,676 cases. Of those, about 7.5% are hospitalized, and a fatality rate just under 1% with 42 fatalities. The hospitals here within Nebraska only have about 42% of beds and 42% of ICU beds currently being occupied. So, as we're seeing the plan for the criteria to bring folks back to the office environment, that criteria is being met. But the reduction in cases here in Douglas County, we are not seeing that 14-day reduction yet. Right now, we're steady. If you look at a 14-day moving average for Douglas County, you'll see that we're at about 140 cases a day, and it's been steady at that level for roughly 4 days right now. So hopefully we'll start seeing a decline, but right now we aren't seeing that decline. And so each state has their own dashboards, and they vary state by state. If you get on Google, you can Google COVID, name of the state, dashboard, and you can pretty easily find it. And lots of great data is out there. Colorado has a lot of good information out there, as does Nebraska. So that's the area of reference that I'm going to here at the district to see what's happening in terms of COVID caseload. So I want to also put that in context. So here in Douglas County, we've had 42 fatalities essentially over the last 3 months while this has been going on. So if you look as a national average, you find we have about 160 heart failures, heart attacks per 100,000 annually, about 150 per 100,000 die of cancer each year, and about 50 per 100,000 die of accidents each year. Right now, what we're seeing with COVID is about 27 cases per 100,000 are having fatalities. So that's about half of those who are dying just of accidents. So in this same time period, statistically, here in Douglas County, there's been between 70 and 80 accidental deaths here in the area versus the 42 related to COVID. So that's just to help kind of put it in context. Oftentimes, I think in the media, it's all over the place. You have some who are saying COVID's really not a big problem, it's just like a bad cold all the way, the world's coming to an end, We all know the truth is somewhere in between in there. So as we developed this plan, as we considered the operating environment which we work, whether it's here in Douglas County in the greater Omaha area or out on the Front Range or at many of our field offices, many of which are in rural areas, the conditions are different. And how do we balance the risk versus the need to execute our mission? Right? We all balance risk every day when we drive in our cars, right? And as a society, we have adapted to that now. For many of us as adults, when we were young kids, nobody wore seatbelts, or the seatbelts were in the car, but nobody put them on. But in the 80s, that culture started changing in our country. We started wearing seatbelts. As young kids, most of us never wore bike helmets. Now, if my kids went out without a bike helmet, they get chewed out, right? Every kid in the neighborhood's wearing a bike helmet. When we're skiing now, everybody wears helmets when they ski. So we take measures to protect ourselves as a society to reduce, in this case, the number of fatalities per 100,000 by taking protective measures. So as we look at bringing the population, our employee population back to the building, how are we going to reduce that risk? Part of it's by how we're phasing people back here to the facility, and secondly, it's by what measures we're taking to do that, and that will include face coverings. So, and you can see that's addressed in the plan, and I'll talk more about the requirement to wear face coverings in common areas as I go through the plan. So that's just to kind of set the context. Now, if you have a copy of the plan, or I hope you've taken the time to read through the plan that was sent out last night, I'm going to go and look at Appendix A. So we put Appendix A together to provide a very simple, quick reference that kind of lays out both the intent, responsibility, and the health protection measures for each one of the 5 phases. So the first phase is Phase 0. That's the phase we're currently in right now, which is a max telework environment. But I think it's important to note, throughout this, we have kept the district offices open for employees to access on an as-needed basis, or if their jobs require them to be here because of either the role that they play or the systems they need to access, that still remains available. I think in general we've had probably around a 10 to 15% building load any given day over the last month, just from my sense of walking around and engaging with folks. So, as of this Friday, the janitorial, the security, and the cafeteria staff will begin wearing masks at all times when in common areas. And that's a change from where we have been with the GSA's building policy. Because the building load had been so light over the last month, we had not been expecting or requiring that of the security, janitorial, or cafeteria staff. But as we begin to increase building load, it's going to be increasingly important that they, along with the rest of the employees of the building, not just USACE, but the other federal agencies in the building, will begin wearing face masks in the common areas. So that includes from when you walk into the building, through the lobbies, in the elevators, up the stairwells, and in the elevator lobby areas in the various floors, and also to the restrooms. When you're at your cube or your office environment, you're not required to wear a face mask unless you're in an office environment where you can't maintain 6 feet of distance from fellow employees within that office space. So we're going to continue in Phase 0 until we see roughly a 14-day positive trend in the reduced number of COVID cases here in the greater Omaha area or in whatever field office you work at in your local area. Once we transition to Phase 1, we're looking to increase the building load to something around 25%. We're going to do that by beginning to bring back those who are in the low-risk category and don't have other complicating factors. Complicating factors such as young children at home with no daycare option to take care of those children, or perhaps you have an elderly family member or other family member who is in a high-risk category. For those folks, we'll continue to maintain maximum telework. We will maintain that Phase 1 status of approximately a 25% building load for plus or minus 14 days. Once again, this is not an exact science on when we bring back when we transition from one phase to the next phase. I know our structural engineers, being a structural engineer myself, especially in steel design, we can get an answer to like the 10th decimal point. That's not where we're at. It's much more like geotech, where it's pretty close, and I think I'm comfortable with that. That's more what kind of numbers we're working with, right? We're getting them off of the publicly available data put out by local health authorities, and we're going to make a judgment call. So phase one, looking to get to about 25% building load, and that'll be by bringing back folks who are in the low-risk category and don't have other complicating factors. This whole plan is built around empowering supervisors in making these decisions and working with their staff, right? Because there's all kinds of unique circumstances. We have over 1,200 individuals work for the district. There's probably 1,200 unique circumstances out there. So obviously, the executive office is not in a position to adjudicate every particular case or what about this, what about that. Instead, I want to empower the supervisors to be able to make those decisions with general guidance as laid out in this plan. So, the guidance for phase one is to get to about 25% building occupancy by bringing back those which are in low risk categories and don't have other complicating factors. Then we'll move on to phase two. Phase two is to begin to expand that, get up to about a 50% building load. And that's not just a 50% building load here in this building, it's whichever office you work in, 50% building load. And in that case, we're looking at continuing to bring back those in the low-risk categories and also working with those with other complicating factors, perhaps with the young children, if they're able to start getting daycare, 2 days a week, maybe they come back to the office 2 days a week, and the other 3 days they'd work at home with their kids. But trying to find a balance to start getting more folks back and reestablishing an office-based work environment. So that's going to be upon the supervisors, right? There's not a rigid guidance on that. But the target is, during phase two, to get back up to about 50%. Then after, if we continue to maintain improved COVID conditions within the area, we'll move to a phase three. However, if all of a sudden there's a new spike with COVID cases and we're in phase two, we could retrograde back to a phase one. All of that's going to be dependent on the environment at the time in the local area. So moving on to phase three, which is after over a month, nearly a month and a half, plus or minus 42 days of continued improvement in the reduced number of COVID cases, we'll get to phase three. And phase three is when we continue to work through bringing employees back with other complicating factors, whether that's a family member who's high risk, a family member who works in the emergency medical community, which can complicate situations, or have young children. We want to have supervisors continue to work with them and find ways that they can meet their specific circumstances and get them back to the work environment, even if that is on an adjusted work schedule. Perhaps the hours will be a little different outside the normal core hours, or you work from home 1 or 2 days a week, work in the office now 2 or 3 days a week. Continue to work through that. Child care is going to remain, I think, a challenge throughout the summer. All those summer camps that we were planning to send our kids to, right? They all got canceled pretty much, or they got, they're trying to do these virtual summer camps, which I don't exactly know how those will really work out, but more power. Hopefully, at least the kids will get something out of it. So, and then ultimately we'll be in a position to move to phase four. Right now, that's at least 2 months out before we're in phase four here in the district. I suspect it's probably quite a bit farther than that. But that would be when we're bringing essentially all the employees back here to the work environment. Now with that, once again, there's probably going to be exceptions even within that for folks who have particular high-risk conditions. But all of that's going to need to be worked out with the supervisor to determine how a specific employee comes back to work who has unique circumstances. So those are the 4 phases, or the 5 phases, being phase 0 through phase 4. And then also I want to highlight within the plan, Appendix E. And I encourage you all to make sure you read through Appendix E and understand what it has in there. As much of that talks about protective measures were incorporated, with two include face masks here in the common areas. And you notice in there, I just required face masks in the common areas through phase 2. Now, we have at least a month before we get to phase 3, right? So there's going to be time, and depending on how the environment changes and adapted, there's flexibility in there for the district to require face masks in common areas as well in phase 3, which may be a decision we make. But at this point, I did not incorporate that in the plan, so that we have some flexibility as we start to approach phase 3 and make there's another decision point in there. And part of that will be based on the new information that's coming out all the time on the disease, the effectiveness of face masks, and so we may or may not ultimately expect folks to wear face masks during phase 3. We're just going to have to wait and see. And so I didn't incorporate that in the plan at this time. But you'll see even throughout this, 6 feet social distancing is being reinforced and expected, as well as face masks. I don't specifically expect individuals when you're outside to wear a face mask unless you're in close working proximity with another individual where 6 feet can't be maintained. But once again, we're all adults, and we can use our own judgment that if you're concerned, there's nothing that precludes you from wearing a face mask in your cube, wearing a face mask outside at any time. You need to use your judgment. So, for example, whenever we go to the store, whether it's my wife, my kids, or I, we wear a face mask at Walmart or in any of the stores we go in, because it seems like would I rather not wear a face mask? Yeah, but it seems like a pretty minor sacrifice for the potential risks that I mitigate by doing that. I'd rather not wear a seatbelt in the car, but I realize the consequences are potentially pretty significant, and wearing a seatbelt reduces risk. It doesn't eliminate risk at all, but it does reduce it. So I think you can read through that, and I encourage you to make sure you're keeping your workspace clean. Things like wiping down your cell phone on a daily basis, right? They say cell phones and money are one of the two best ways to transfer the COVID around people, and keeping it with you. So that is the plan. And I think at this point we should probably move to questions that'll probably illuminate some of the plan here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to start asking the questions, and I'll do my best to answer the questions.
All right. What if an employee is not medically cleared to wear a mask for whatever reason?
Okay, so employee is not medically cleared to wear a mask. First, you should engage your supervisor, talk with them about it, and see if you can't work out a plan on how to best accommodate that. The second thing is you can always put in a reasonable accommodation request through EEO. Now, a reasonable accommodation request does require medical documentation of that need. But ideally, I would hope you and your supervisor can talk through that issue and come up with a reasonable solution.
How long do you anticipate it will be mandatory to wear face masks?
So, as I mentioned before, right now, I see it through phase 2 in the common areas. But that will remain on the table as something viable going into phase 3. We'll just see what the conditions, if that's warranted or not, as we're ready to go into phase 3.
Okay. The reintegration phases are dependent on the downward trajectory of suspected or confirmed COVID-19 cases. Can you discuss if this downward trend is based off of 14 days consecutively, with each having less cases than the day before? Or is this downward trend based off of a linear regression line, where a few days in between the 14 days may have an increase, but the overall trend is declining?
Yeah, so I kind of addressed that in my opening remarks. Essentially, it's not an absolute, every day has to show a decline. It is there a general downward trend? So, like, I took the data off of the dashboard, the Douglas County dashboard, where they have, if you at the bottom, there's a bunch of tabs. There's a tab, number of confirmed cases per day, and I think today was 121. Yesterday was 147. And I've put that into a little spreadsheet going back to one May each day, and then I did what is the rolling average 3-day, 5-day, 10-day, and 14-day. And what it shows is right now the average is about 140 a day in the 14-day moving average. And so while that's not the absolute metric I'm going to use ultimately make the decision, it certainly informs the decision. And so if we have one day that spikes, if you look back at Douglas County, a couple days ago we had over 200 cases. 2 days in the last week we had over 200 cases in one day. Well, that's not good, and that's not trending in the right direction. But if we look at the overall average, we've actually only been averaging about 140 cases a day. So we're looking at the averages over, looking for trend lines and not specific cases.
All right. Per page 2 of the COVID-19 reintegration, to move to COVID phase 1, the work or location area must have a 14-day downward trajectory of suspected or confirmed COVID-19 cases. What numbers should we be tracking? Percentage of positive cases per week, number of cases per week, or total cumulative cases count?
I think I kind of addressed that. And the key is, though, what the numbers are showing in Douglas County, in the metro Omaha area, right? You can also get the other counties in the area have similar dashboards. It should be based on your office's local area. So in the metro Denver area for the Denver area office, or the metro Colorado Springs area for our Rocky Mountain area office, or if you're, at Hawaii, what's happening there in Pierre. And so look at the local conditions on the ground as we look at those rates.
All right, next question. The state of Nebraska's Microsoft COVID-19 tracker site, for example, appears to have had a downward trend for about a week, and then flatlined for several days, and then increased by 1. Is this still considered a downward trend, or does the clock start over when there was an increase of 1?
Well, at the state level, I'd consider that a downward trend, but once again, I'm looking a little more local than that, right? I mean, we live in very large states, the district's in, and what's happening, in western Nebraska is not going to drive the decisions that happen here in eastern Nebraska. The same with whether you're in Montana or the Dakotas. I think we should try to look at the more local data when available. We can certainly look more holistically at the state data, but what's happening in Council Bluffs is more relevant, I think, in the decision than what's happening, say out in, in the western end of Nebraska. So I'm not looking as much at the state and more at the local numbers.
The CDC guidelines recommend against shared food such as potlucks, buffets, etc. Are we going to be following that guideline as we return to the Z building?
So, in general, throughout my command, I've had a tendency to avoid trying to do very prescriptive policies, whatever the issue is. As we have a tendency, I think, within bureaucratic organizations to be very prescriptive. And I think that inhibits the organization's flexibility. So on items such as that, my expectation is you're all adults, and if you're not comfortable with things like potluck and food, then don't participate in it. Secondly, I think, with that said, I don't think a potluck is probably advisable at this point. Probably, maybe in phase 3 it will be. At some point, conditions will warrant it, but I do not want to be prescriptive, and I was intentional within the plan not to get very prescriptive on do's and don'ts. Right? My expectation is it's an organization of 1,250 adults who can make wise and prudent decisions.
Okay. If we are in any one of the phases for reintegration and there is a spike in COVID cases, does that delay the next phase, or does that trigger a restart back to phase 0?
It could be either. It'll depend on the circumstances. I would think at the very least it'll delay moving to the next phase, right, because it'll break the 14-day downward trend. But it certainly could result in in going back a phase. So if we're phase 2 going back to phase 1 back to phase 0.
Okay. Colonel Hudson may already be planning on addressing this question, but I wanted to pose it anyway. He has alluded in past town hall meetings to the fact that the return to the office will be phased and consideration will be given to those employees who have underlying medical conditions that may make them more susceptible to COVID-19. My question is, what consideration will be given to employees who don't themselves have any underlying medical conditions, but who have immediate family members who do. My particular concern is that with a return to the office, I could bring COVID-19 home to a susceptible family member.
Well, yeah, I think that's a real concern, right? And that's what we tried to build in to the plan, as you see in phase 2 and phase 3 is where we would start addressing that with bringing in folks with what I called it in this case other complicating factors, right? And that could be, and that would, you having a family member at home in high-risk category, certainly in my mind fall within that category, and there should be discussions with your supervisor to work through that, to find a reasonable way to do that to reduce the risk, because we don't want to be an incubator for COVID here in the building and risk bringing that home to family members. And so we're going to be very deliberate going through that process.
Okay. My question is, what consideration will be given to employees who don't themselves have any underlying medical conditions, but who have immediate family members who do? My particular concern is that with the return to the office, I could bring, it's kind of the same
I think that's the
question.
same question.
Yeah,
We
you
answered that
asked
one. Let's go to the next one.
Okay. This one pertains to telework and traveling. When travel restrictions are lifted, will TDY be permitted even if an individual's local workplace is in the initial phases, such as phase 0 or phase 1 of the reintegration plan?
Well, so TDY, even now with the TDY restrictions in place, if it's mission essential, we can still do TDY, and we have folks across the district who do TDY. That authority to approve that TDY is, as of this week, was delegated down to General Helmlinger, our division commander. And we've put up, Scott, about how many have we put up requests?
About anywhere from 7 to about 14 a week.
Yeah, so a dozen or so a week we've been requesting, and all of which had been approved. So we're still doing TDY, even in this COVID environment. But as we get to June 30th, remember, anytime you go TDY, it should be based on, both, it's relevant for a mission, obviously, and then also that it's been coordinated with your supervisor. And I would hope you're having a conversation with your supervisor. How important is this that they go to this place? And if that location you're going to has is a hot spot for COVID, certainly if it's overseas, discretion needs to be made and discussion between your supervisor, maybe your supervisor, and the relevance of the mission. We're just not done immediately go to mission as usual and everybody just start going TDY without thinking through that process. We need to make sure that we're deliberate and considering TDY across the organization. So the question is, implied, hey, if it's good here, not COVID, but can I travel to an area where COVID's a big challenge? Maybe if it's mission essential, but I think you need to seriously consider that and understand the risks of any location you travel with and make sure that steps are being made to mitigate that risk.
Okay. Has there been any guidance as to how the current travel restrictions will be lifted? Will the travel restrictions be lifted all at once, or will travel to and from certain CONUS locations remain restricted until certain conditions are met?
I really don't know the answer fully on that, but I do, we get guidance from headquarters, just like earlier this week, they changed the approval level to General Helmlinger. I expect to continue to have additional guidance come down. Will the 30 June date move into July? Potentially, but I don't have any great insight on that.
Okay. With municipalities, states, and countries reopening to varying degrees, will the DoD travel ban be allowed to expire on 30th of June? Is travel without waiver or approval allowed starting 1st of July?
So, well, I kind of addressed that already. All TDY still gets approved, right? Even in a normal operating environment, right? Your supervisor is approving your travel. But we won't have to go above General Helmlinger for travel. And I would suspect what's going to happen when they do adjust the guidance, they'll still have some areas you can't travel to. I just don't know what that would be. But as soon as we get that guidance, we pass it on down through the organization so that folks are aware of what is and isn't allowed.
Okay. After travel restrictions are lifted, will individuals returning from TDY be required to self-isolate or telework for any period of time?
Well, that'll depend where you travel to. Hopefully, we had some folks who self-isolated early in this case. They traveled back from Europe. They were caught up in Europe when the COVID started hitting. In fact, one of them barely got back before the flights all got scratched, and they had them self-isolate. I would hope we're not sending individuals to places which would create the need to self-isolate, but that might be a relevant course of action. But once again, I think that'd be a case-by-case basis, working with the supervisors and knowing either where the individual has gone on TDY or maybe the environment back here might warrant that. So I don't think there's an absolute answer for something like that.
Okay. Are those 65 years and over to be brought back in phase 3 or phase 4?
Well, certainly by phase 4, they'll expect it to be back in a normal work environment, but some of that might happen in phase 3, and that's why I didn't get overly specific at phase 3 in defining criteria, because I want to give flexibility for supervisors working with their team to make that determination. Remember, phase 3 is to get to 75%, roughly 75% building load, and phase 4 to 100%. Now remember, those building loads for phase 1, 2, and 3, the 25, 50, 75, that's an approximate number. We're not going to be out there doing head counts and say, oh, you're one over, you're one under, get one more in. I mean, it's not going to be, it's not a rigid number. It's a approximate.
Here, my numbers from you.
Oh, if you're not on mute, please get on mute.
All right, will the people who do not want to wear a face mask be afforded the same privileges to telework as those that chose to stay home during the maximum telework time?
No.
Okay. All right, we have a few questions from we're going to take a break from that section here, sir, and we're going to do a few questions that are coming through on the WebEx. Will there be voluntary temperature testing stations per the plan on page 82?
Yes. So, Jeff, did we decide, is it going to be in the business centers where we're putting it? So in the business centers, on each floor, we'll have a little area set aside. So individuals go in, you can shut the door in the business center if you want privacy, and there'll be a digital thermometer that you hold like an inch away from your forehead, take your temperature. There'll be wipes there so you can wipe it all down, and that'll be put at each business center. When do you expect to have those in place? This week. So we'll have them in by the end of the week. That'll be on 4 floors. So on the 9th, 8th, 7th, and 6th, and 5th. So 5 floors. Yeah. So it's going to be out there. Maybe Division will put one in on the 3rd floor. We'll see.
Okay. Another one from WebEx. Since the power plants are already at phase 2 and have been at this phase for 6 weeks, is it possible to go back to our normal shifts? While most are at home working, we are on site for 12.5 hours a day, and on those days, it is taking a major toll on ourselves, relationships, families, and so much more. We have upcoming outages and work orders that can't be completed with a single person, and at times with hard even with 2. There is also a safety factor involved with working solo.
Yeah, so Keith Fink and I have been talking a fair bit about this. When do we get off of the split shift? Which I have to applaud the teams out at all 6 of our hydropower plants have been doing a tremendous job of being flexible with this. We've been working closely with the union on it. I would like to, here in the reasonably near future, move off of that. However, I think we're going to be pretty deliberate about that. We're having those conversations between Keith, the OPMs, myself. I don't have a firm timeline on when we're going to do that, but I understand we're balancing, there's some risk. What if, the impacts if COVID does end up at the power plant versus the other challenges that the individuals on the team are facing, as was, I think, well stated in there, both the safety aspects of it and the schedule impacts on their personal lives as well. So I'm sensitive to that, and I would like to move off the split shift here. So we're talking through that.
Will different areas of the Omaha District be in different phases based on their local data, or is it solely based on Omaha and Douglas County? If different phases, how will we know what phase our area is in?
Yeah, so there will be different phases. I think I talked about that for a bit. And it's going to be the senior individual within your area. So if you're in an area office, say say if you're in the Denver area office, Neil Parker's going to be the guy, right? And he's going to disseminate that, right? It's going to be Heather down in Colorado Springs, and then the OPMs at the power plants. So it's going to be the senior supervisor responsible for that office area will be the lead to propose moving between phases, and they will propose it to their division chief. So if it's a construction area office, it'll go up through Pete Sturdivant to myself. If it's a regulatory office, it'll go up through the regulatory chain, up ultimately to Keith Fink, and I'll have a conversation, and the same OPMs up through Keith Fink to make a decision, and then that senior lead for that office area will then be expected to appropriately disseminate that information to the folks who work in that area.
Will there be any change in the change of command date at the end of June for Colonel Hudson to Colonel Hanks?
Yes, I was going to actually mention that at the end. What we're still doing a change of command date on 8 July. However, it's going to be a small ceremony here in the building. It won't be at the Doubletree as we traditionally do. Of course, I think that's unfortunate for the agency because it's an important ceremony that shows that transition of authority. But it's going to be a smaller ceremony, which we will be sending either over YouTube Live or WebEx. We're going to compare the notes of these 3 different tools that we use now, and it'll be live simulcast across the district, and it hopefully will be publicly available too, so our stakeholders can be part of it. But right now, we're looking at a ceremony that will probably incorporate about 40 individuals between those who are in the ceremony, those supporting the ceremony, like the tech team, the family members. The Himes and Hudson family members, and then probably the corporate board will be in attendance. But aside from that, everybody else will likely be virtual.
Page F2 of the reintegration plan says supervisors are responsible for the procurement of disinfectant and cleaning supplies for their employees in their specific workplace or area of responsibility. Please clarify this. Why are supervisors responsible for this, and what funding is available to do so?
So maybe that wasn't the best worded, but the intent there is that each office has an impact credit card, and whoever's the senior individual for that office, maybe it's a branch chief, maybe it's a resident engineer, is going to be expected to ensure that their office area is properly resourced, leveraging what they have, which is the impact credit card. And we have impact credit cards all over the district, and that's what should be used to get those supplies as needed. So some supervisors don't have anybody with an impact credit card, don't have that responsibility, so it's not going to be their problem to deal with. But others, like a resident engineer, absolutely have that responsibility to take care of.
Okay. Since phase 1 will not begin until the work location area has a 14-day downward trajectory of suspected or confirmed COVID-19 cases for the Zerinsky building, what are you considering the work location or area? Is it Douglas County or a certain zip code? I think you addressed
Yeah, I've
that.
kind of addressed that.
Okay, here's another. My staff has asked for an update related to the Bright Horizons child care facility in the Zerinsky building. My staff has heard nothing regarding a plan for reopening and would like USA's leadership to coordinate with GSA and the Bright Horizons leadership on a plan. This is critical for several members of my staff being able to return to work in the building. The Bright Horizons facility, located in the First National Bank of Omaha building, has already reopened, and that was largely due to the coordination between the leadership of both the building and the child care.
So, yes, we're already coordinating with GSA. That was a major part of the conversation. They had a big meeting on Tuesday. That was one of the major issues that was discussed in that and how they're going to do it. Part of the reason it hasn't reopened is because the federal agencies in the building are still maintaining max telework, so there's not the demand right now for it. But as we get into and start executing these phases, now that demand is there, and they're coming through and they're working through the specific procedures on how they will ensure how they will reduce the risk of COVID within child care center, which will include the limited access to it, keeping small groups of children together. They don't, the young kids won't be expected to be wearing masks while in there. So they're working through that. What's the latest? By phase 2, we're going to hopefully be in a position where it could be open. So that's still being coordinated, the dates. Remember, in phase 1, we're not necessarily looking to bring back folks who have young children, although the earlier we can get it open, the more that becomes a flexible option. Now, remember, majority of our employees that use childcare don't do it through the facility here in the building, but through other facilities around town, and when they open, I'm sure is going to vary quite a bit. And that's part of why there's a lot of discretion that needs to happen between that employee and the supervisor and working through how are those child care issues being addressed.
Okay, when can we expect to be notified on what category we fall into, and how much lead time will be provided to know when we will be going back into the office? So,
let's take the second half of that question first. As far as lead time, I would expect that you're going to have, once you're looking at a 14-day trend, we're probably about halfway through that. Say, hey, things are looking good. Right now we're at, maybe 7-8 days. If a positive trend, if this continues, we'll be looking at bringing people back on this date. But I would think it won't be, and we'll continue that conversation as we get closer to 14 days. Keep you informed. I've been trying to, as relevant information's come up, informing people via email. But I would think about once we're at 10 days on the 14-day time period, if it's still trending positive, we'd say, hey, be prepared. Hey, next Monday or next Thursday, we're going to start bringing people back in the building. But that'll all be coordinated through supervisors. And I don't think it's going to be a hard and fast rule. All of a sudden today we need to have all 25% of phase 1 here in the building. But I would think you'll certainly get several days' notice ahead of time as that plays out. What was the first part of that question again? Oh, how do you know which category you're in? Well, that's going to have to be a conversation with your supervisor to figure that out. If you're some of this is pretty obvious, right? It's all the in-betweens that aren't, right? If you're under 65, you don't have young kids at home, you don't have pre-existing health conditions that are significant, you don't have, somebody with high risk at home, as you look through that, you're probably in phase 1. If you have small kids, maybe you're in phase 2. Maybe if you have child care readily available, you could be in phase 1, but all that gets conversation with your supervisors. If you're over 65, or if you have medical conditions that put you in the high-risk category, I would think you're in either phase 3 or maybe phase 4. But once again, that you need to have a conversation with your supervisor, kind of work through that. I don't want to be rigid, because every time you get a rigid guidance and something like that, there's a myriad of exceptions.
Okay, I'm just looking through, sir, to see if we have any additional questions. Someone did ask if your plan would be posted to water coolers, so I can go ahead and post that if it's fine.
Yeah, it's good. You go ahead and put it in the water cooler.
Let me just check the email, see if we have anything else. Looks like we're all set for now. Do you have another one?
When does phase 1 start?
Oh, when does phase 1 start?
After we have improved 14
I think
days.
for Z building, a couple people asked.
Oh, for the Z building?
When does it start?
Well, I think it's at least 14 days out from now. We'll see what the data shows. I don't see it happening here, certainly in the next week and a half.
Okay. Can we describe a mask? Does a scarf qualify as adequate?
I think so. I mean, the key is that it covers the nose and covers the mouth. So I have mine right here, which is made from a shop towel. I'd sent out a video back, I don't know, a couple months ago about that, how I did it. I found it to be more comfortable, quite honestly, than a lot of the cloth ones. Oh, I should also mention that all employees, we've ordered enough masks for everybody. I have 2 face covering masks. Were they put on their desks? Where were they? So they're on their desk. So if you haven't been back in the building in the last, say, a month or two, you'll find 2 masks on your desk, which you can use. I don't think we're going to go around and start policing, hey, that mask is good, that mask isn't good. The key is that it covers your nose and your mouth, right? So that, as you talk, as you exhale, you're spraying particles in the air, if in case you sneeze, any of those things. It's all to keep that stuff contained and reduce spread. So we're not looking for medical grade masks on every employee. If you want to wear a medical grade mask, that's fine. But the key is having your nose and your mouth covered.
A couple additional questions that just came in. What is the safety protocol for outside contractors doing work inside the Zerinsky building in regards to COVID-19? And a follow-up, what are the safety protocols for use of elevators once we start moving back into the Zerinsky building?
So the second part is wear a mask in the elevators at least through phase 2, as the plan's currently laid out. I didn't put in there, we had some discussion, the corporate board had extensive discussions about this plan over really about a 2-week period or so on what we're going to do. And we talked about, should we limit number of individuals within the elevator? And ultimately came to the decision that not to do that. And one, we require everybody to wear a mask, right? It's in the common area. And secondly, individuals can make their own decision. Hey, you think the elevator's too full? Wait for the next one. We know in the building here we got 6 elevators. So elevators typically don't get overcrowded too much, or you can wait a few minutes if you're uncomfortable getting in with multiple individuals with the elevator. So we did discuss that. And then, how do we enforce that? Do we have one of the security guards staying there doing an elevator count? So it became a difficult thing how we're going to necessarily originally enforce it. So we opted not to include that specifically. As for contractors working in the building, like we do have contractors who are finishing up the EOC on the 3rd floor. Was that talked about with the GSA meeting on Tuesday? I might have to take that as a do-out.
We did not talk about contractors based on the contract, so we don't know whether we can enforce that or not. As far as other agencies working in the building and contracts that we oversee, yes, like
Okay,
downstairs.
so they didn't talk specifically about the contractors. There is, like I mentioned, there's one on the 3rd floor. But all the other federal agencies in the building have essentially agreed upon the face coverings within the common areas. And like I said, cafeteria, janitorial, and security will, as of Friday, begin wearing them here in the building.
Okay. Will there be additional security measures if the protests are still going on during phase 1?
Yeah, I certainly hope in the next couple of weeks those risks will decrease. But and we stay very tuned to that. Michael Wayne, who's our chief of security, is tied in with the local police officials and keeps track of what are security risks. So, for instance, on was it Monday? Monday, when the local prosecutor was doing his press conference that they didn't expect to file charges on the shooting that happened over the weekend. We were informed shortly before that conference about that decision was coming out, and we sent out an email to the workforce, encouraging them to wrap up for the day. And we'll do the same. If there's elevated risk, we'll certainly take precautions, whether that is encouraging folks to stay home. I know this happened back a little over 3 years ago during the DAPL. There were protests, and we took actions here in the building to address safety issues, and we do the same this time. But hopefully, both for our local and our national sake, I hope these protests, or at least the violent aspects of the protest, are no longer present a couple weeks from now. But we'll see.
Okay. Has TDY with air travel been approved if it is mission essential?
Yes, but those are all a case-by-case basis.
Okay. don't see any additional questions on topics we haven't covered, sir.
Okay. Okay, well, just a couple things then to wrap up. I plan to do another town hall in about 2 weeks. I think we have the calendar on tentatively scheduled for 2 weeks from Tuesday, or Tuesday, 2 weeks from now. And at 10 o'clock, I think it was Central Time. I might be wrong in time. In any case, you'll get an email on it. We also plan to do flood fight awards virtually. We're going to do it down the first floor, and in some way that we're going to use it as kind of a dress rehearsal for the change of command to make sure we have all the tech and stuff set up and how we do it. But we're going to do the flood fight awards to recognize the more than 200 individuals here in the district who over the last now 18 months have just done an incredible effort on restoring, both responding to the flooding back in March of 19 and working to restore the levee system. So we're going to do a virtual award ceremony. Doing that, we're going to be grouping awards based off of logical groupings, like maybe you worked on a specific levee system or you were part of a certain team with the response, and we'll be putting out more information on that. And the date for that, what's the date for that?
18th.
18th of this month, so 18 June, we're going to be doing a virtual town hall. Change of command, I already mentioned, is going to be a virtual event largely. That'll be held here in the building and not at the Doubletree. We'll be putting out information on that here in the next week, both to district internal as well as our external stakeholders, announcing it'll be a virtual event. And then finally, the Core Day, or our annual district picnic that was scheduled for 26 June. Based on the COVID environment, we are postponing it, and it's now rescheduled for it's a Friday, 7 August. And I think it's the same place there at Carter Lake, or
Either Carter Lake, or we'd also looked at doing Weirspans.
it could be out at Wearspan. So it's either going to be Carter Lake or Wearspan. They're still working through that. We've got a great team, which, of course, if you want to volunteer to be part of the team, they'd be willing and able to help provide some great opportunities for you to help plan in that event. Okay, so with that, I appreciate you spending the last hour here doing this telework. Continue to provide feedback. You can also send comments on the town hall to PAO, same email address you sent questions in, and we'll address those as appropriate. I'll probably be sending out another email, I would expect, before the end of this week, maybe in capturing some more questions or clarifications on the plan. In the meantime, I greatly appreciate the tremendous work you're doing across the district, whether that's up at our natural resource office or power plants, our regulatory offices out in the field, our construction offices, and then here at headquarters with all the teleworking that's going on. We have a tremendous amount of work to do as we're getting ready to enter fourth quarter here. We're less than a month out from fourth quarter, and still well over, what's the number, I think about $700 million worth of contracting left to execute. So there's a lot of work across the organization to achieve that. I'm confident we will. We do each year in support of our stakeholders across not only our geographic boundaries, but really around the world with all of our special projects and programs. So with that, have a great afternoon and continue to stay safe. Thanks.